instructional specialist with the Department of Special Ed Services and easily
So
distractible.
who are you?
So I'm Sarah Cayo, and I'm an instructional specialist with the Department of Special Education Services with Montgomery County.
Well, my name is Ashley Doyle, and I'm an instructional specialist in the Department of Special Education Services.
My name is Sarah Finch Jackson, and I'm the twice exceptional instructional specialist in the Office of Accelerated and Enriched Instruction.
Paraeducator, kind of a temporary paraeducator supporting one student in that, what we then called the high functioning autism or Asperger's program. It was right when it started, and it was a very, very tiny group of kids, a lot of comorbidity with emotional and very large outward behaviors. And so, I got to see that, and we had kids. One of the kids I had to work with, everything had to relate to the Ottoman Empire. Otherwise, you just wouldn't even touch it. So I got to learn a lot about the Ottoman Empire. But it kind of triggered things for me because you see this kid who's obviously just can do incredible things, when it comes to kind of what things we take for granted as kind of those kind of adaptive things. I had kids who could definitely have taken way higher math than I ever did in high school, but couldn't tie their shoes. You have these kids that have this incredible exceptionality. You see them and they're screaming because, they're laying on the floor crying because, saying like, why do I have to work with these idiots in class? They don't know anything about, they don't even care about learning. And, you're like, well, they're second graders. So, you see these kids and they end up, and then one point, I don't know the statistics anymore, but I'd gone to a presentation about students with autism and their graduation rates. And it was abysmal. You think, these are literally the kids who are going to change the world. Meetings all the time, I tell parents, we're just cogs in the machine, right? It's these kids who think very differently that are going to come up with the cure that saves needs.
So is that how you first got to know like what twice exceptional was? Is because you had kids?
It was. I had some students who were puzzles and were clearly super bright, but also had some areas of need and really weren't functioning well in their general education classrooms, but they weren't necessarily like the typical students that you would expect to have special education needs.
How does that approach like your mentality with these students, having that duality of need?
I think it was there's something different going on here. They were clearly able to do the work, but they weren't able to either manage themselves in their classrooms or manage their behaviors, or even if they had the academic skills and we knew they had the skills and the teachers knew they had the skills, they weren't performing to their potential or even really completing classroom assignments. And so there was something there in their 504 plans that were revised and revised and revised, really just weren't enough.
So it was for these kids, at least you started with essentially lower level intervention with the 504 and finding that they needed that special education piece.
Yeah, at least for the initial students that I worked with.
And then I continued on for a master's in special education, and I have a specialty in transition and severe and profound birth to age 21.
So that's about as far from twice exceptional as you can get on the impact scale.
It is, but you still have students with all different learning needs, even at a different continuum of their educational journeys and how they're impacted in their day-to-day lives.
What are common misconceptions that you hear from special ed teachers or gen ed teachers?
The bright but lazy, or putting the onus back on the student, that they just need to do whatever it is a little bit more. They just need to get their work done, or they need to follow directions or whatever it may be, and not necessarily that there's a reason why that student is struggling.
I think a lot of it has to do with what you identify as what describes who the learner is or is not, and what's in your repertoire of skill set. Even people who are very knowledgeable about twice exceptional in general may not identify every aspect along the way. There are so many markers that fly under the radar and can be seen as, for example, a student with behavioral concerns, where in fact they are disengaged because the instruction doesn't meet their intellectual needs, or the hook isn't there to get the students in and excited about learning in a way that resonates with them. So students will find other outlets for expressing themselves, and most often that can can be through behavior. And the behavior is often, I guess, a misconception, so to say, because I've been called in for concerns around behavior. And as we start to look a little deeper, we're seeing some markers or indicators that there's other underlying factors going on. And more often than not, students that have been initially referred for behavioral concerns have had some indicators where their learning profile isn't completely average. So we have students where they may meet the criteria for twice exceptional, where they have some very high level skills, but also an area or more where they are not performing in the same standard deviation or the same area on a bell curve with their learning needs. So we have to look at multiple sources, and how do I approach that? Often by digging deeper and asking a lot of questions. And then I take the opportunity to learn alongside with other professionals in the field that may not be as knowledgeable about these areas as I've learned. And if I don't know, I ask and reach out to other colleagues who have more expertise in that area to help us along that journey of learning together so we can better support the needs of our students.
I mean, I think it's important for me to be honest here and say, like, when I first started, I looked at kids that are kind of high performing and say, they can't have, they're in advanced classes. Why do they need an IEP? And it kind of took other people and experience and so on and so forth to help me guide. So I do want to see anybody listening that I think we've probably all encountered it. Probably we've all been there. I definitely am further along in that journey. I'm nowhere near perfect yet. And I think some of the research and understanding of this will yet to come. Exciting. But I kind of want to start there to say we're all in different places, and that's okay. But then, so
I think it gives me a different lens to look at students through and to help school teams think differently. I think a lot of the time schools will look at, here's how a student is performing academically, they're on grade level, and knowing that there's a problem, but not necessarily wanting to make that jump to, but this student needs special education because either they're bright, or I feel like I hear a lot of the time they're bright, but they're lazy.
Mm-hmm. What about like during identification parts in IEP meetings? Because then you also have administrators you're dealing with and parents. Like, what are some of the other misconceptions that come up when you're having those discussions with people who are not just classroom based?
I think the idea that you can have really strong cognitive skills, but also have significant and atypical needs in other areas. I think we see either the student who the school team is sure that this child is bright and they know it, but they're not performing to their potential and they are performing below grade level. And I think that's the easiest situation to work a team through. Then I think there are the students who we think there might be a gifted piece there. There are some things that are making us question, but they're kind of just average across the board. And they're masking their disability and they're masking their giftedness. And being able to have those conversations. And then the students who probably are the ones who don't necessarily need the IEPs, who are gifted and are achieving above grade level, but may have some needs in another area. And sometimes they do if it's a social, emotional, or an executive functioning need. But I think helping school teams to pinpoint what is the need and what could specially designed instruction in this area look like. Because when we're looking at specially designed instruction, SDI, for kids who or students who are twice exceptional, it's not the traditional specially designed instruction that schools are used to providing. I think once school teams are able to think differently, that, okay, this might be specific instruction in executive functioning, or this, we may be addressing some of these writing pieces. The student may have these great ideas, but the organization isn't there. And having that conversation, doing the evaluation to either confirm or realize that our theory wasn't right, and then looking at where do we go from there.
Yeah, it's huge. Frankly, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed when I see our programs, both our highly gifted programs and centers and our twice exceptional programs, because it is absolutely not representative of who we are as a county. And I always, say to people, like, they're just kids. What are we doing wrong? We ultimately control the system. The kids don't choose. Part of what my job is to go out and observe kids and considerations throughout the program. one of the things it's always shocking to me, although it's stopped being so shocking because I've seen it so many times, is, I bring up, go see a young Black boy. They're like, well, he's not really making eye contact. He will only do this when I've just come from another school with, similar, every other factor is the same except race. And the school's like, I think they need our GTLD program, our 2E program. And you're like, well, what is it about this student that's different than this? Their performance is exactly the same. And I'll be blunt, is to say, in my experience, human beings are more likely to jump to assuming that it's a willful thing or a social emotional primary focus for our non-white students. For our white kids, there's a lot more leeway given. I really, really take seriously my role asking questions to draw out some different thoughts. It's a problem. But then, so in terms of barriers, we hear from teachers to say, we often not, I want to be fair, but we have especially gen ed teachers, but often special ed teachers, and they're like, look, they just don't want to. They're being willful. They're being manipulative. They're being this, that, and sometimes we're talking about 7-year-olds. Right? My car payment is older than this human being. Possible they're not a fully formed thing, and they don't. Yeah, I mean, yes, behavior plays a role in that. But when I kind of ask, if we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, like, tell me what their reaction is. And they're like, well, shut up about it. And you're like, okay, well, how can we start merging these worlds? So I think, again, going back to my initial point, it is tricky, right? And it requires a team and some critical thinking and people who come at it. Like, based on my experiences, I come at it based on your experiences, Sarah. You may come at it a little differently, and it takes a lot of people sometimes to just say, let me tell you about my story, because everybody has it a little differently, and I think storytelling is such a huge piece of it, just in terms of phrasing mine versus just going and being like, look, it says here, you have to do it. That people are going to be resistant.
Some of the barriers are the time of the day. So if, for example, a student is being provided different tier instruction within their home school setting, the opportunity for those extension or project-based lessons, and then the follow through and the support to make sure that students, one, understand what the expectation is and how it's different than perhaps some of their other peers in their class, because their learning needs are different. And then the teachers need to provide some explicit scaffolded up expectations, and then the follow through from staff on making sure that students are meeting those expectations and or exceeding them. And if not, coaching them through that process with fidelity. Those are some of the challenges in a general comprehensive setting when there's resistance to implementing the upward scaffolded instruction or enriched learning that students may require in order to really target and meet their learning needs. When they have a more of a 2E or twice exceptional learning profile. When students are in program, meaning that they may require specially designed instruction in a very specific scripted or prescripted setting with other learners that may have similar but different learning needs than themselves, that students can engage in what we would call maladaptive behaviors, because they're, for a variety of reasons, but it's a form of communication. They're communicating that something's not quite right. So continuing to work to get it right until you really see students thriving in that learning environment. So the barriers with the education is really matching the instructional targets to their learning needs and making sure that there are enough coaching and scaffolded help along the way to encourage them to complete either project-based learning or enriched learning opportunities through other avenues.
So in terms of barriers for services, I mean, I think in Montgomery County, we're fortunate that we do have twice exceptional programming that we don't have across the country in a lot of school districts, but these students are typically outliers and they don't fit into that traditional mold of what a student in an inclusion program may look like, and their needs are different, and that can stretch staff because they're meeting the needs of this reading group over here, this social skill group over here, this math group over here, they're co-teaching here. And then you have this student whose IEP is very different and their needs are very different, and they don't necessarily fit in or have a peer group in their school. And so servicing that student can be difficult and require us to get creative. And I think sometimes educators need permission to be creative and do that creative work, because these kids don't, I mean, students in special education don't fit the box in general, but our twice exceptional students don't always fit that more traditional special education box.
And I like when you said permission, because I say that a lot, is sometimes we have the great idea, but we feel like we don't have permission to do it.
I think cross grade level grouping, I mean, I don't think that's super creative. I think it can be that, okay, I have this student in first grade and I have this student in second grade, but they have similar needs. And so we can meet both their needs as a student with a disability and their needs as a gifted student through cross grade level grouping. Also, I think of one student in particular that I had, and looking at just ways to do project-based learning outside of what was being done in the classroom for all students. We did a lot of compacting with his work, and he was able to show and demonstrate mastery pretty quickly, but also had some pretty significant behavioral needs. And when he was having to do all of the work that he'd already demonstrated he could do, the behaviors would become more significant. But when he was engaged in things that related to the curriculum, but also that he had some say in developing, I know he developed a whole diorama of the school that was to scale, and did the math for that. And that was hands-on and something that he was interested in. And that was also a reward for him, that he got this stuff done that he had to get done, and then could work on this project that challenged him.
And then I did get these kids because of, I'm a male in elementary school, and we're kind of a unicorn, right? There aren't too many of us. So I'd get called in on all these other things. And I'm always, everybody knows, give me the toughest cases. So I would kind of go and I'd see these other kids and I'd talk to them. And they just, depending on what level they are, how old they are and where they are developmentally, like some of them were able to kind of really beautifully describe their struggle, kind of build that relationship with them, look out for them, and kind of talk to their teachers. And it took me a long time to kind of build my approach to the teacher to say, look, this kid gets it. They're not being willful. Like they're really frustrated. And to be really honest, you're missing some stuff here. And that's tough, right? That's tough to go to a colleague. And especially if you're a younger teacher and go to an older colleague who's done this for, however long, and say, like, there is another way to look at me. I can think of the kids that I do think about from time to time and say, I wish I could go back and do it. It's a hard thing to carry sometimes, but I say it, we're all on a journey, right? And do it. And it's okay. You've got to do your best and just kind of be reflective.
But one of those kids that we worked with last year, where I think one of the big complaints was all he wanted to talk about was like World War II. But when we got in the classroom, he was perfectly happy to talk with us about Mars. I mean, they were working on something with Alaska sled dogs, but we had a great conversation about life on Mars, because that's what he felt like doing. And he was able to relate to what it was the teacher was teaching. We just had to kind of lie on the floor and talk to him for a while before he was able to do that piece. So
yeah, there was a good 7 minutes of really awkward silence, and kind of not coming in guns blazing. And that's where, and again, special ed teachers are under an incredible amount of stress, right? But that's where it may be a special ed, it may be a counselor, it may be somebody else that has that time to be able to come and slide in. But that may be that person who goes out and kind of slowly builds relationship at recess. But it really is that kind of perspective and building relationship. Yeah, exactly. I think about him and I think I want to talk to you to see how he's doing. I bet it's incredible. But yeah, it's a kid who basically wasn't doing any work all year. Who also, Sarah, you went in and like, I mean, he must have had 30 books in his desk, all of them about 7/8 read. Could probably speak, at length about all of them. But again, yeah, I mean that's and it was a great gen ed teacher, right? I mean, the guy was great, but the two of them just were oil and water, and sometimes it does take a team. So that's important for people to realize too, right? I mean, there are definitely kids, I'm sure for you, Sarah, the same is like, it's not me, I'm not the one, right? You need somebody else to kind of to do that. There's nobody on the earth that can relate to every student on earth, and that's where you got to kind of take the ego away and say, let me figure out who that is. It's not me, but it's somebody. So to be able to kind of take that pathway
and for the older kids, at least, you can sometimes have that conversation of, I'm your case manager, but I'm not your person.
That's
So
right.
you need to tell me who your person is so I can do more communication with them and not harp on you so much.
Yeah.
And it takes that team or that community to support them.
And then from there, dude, see like, hey, what works, right? Again, that's go with the what works model.
Well, it's not always as easy as it would look because change is hard. And people don't like to necessarily change when they feel like their process or their approach is challenged, or they need to change what they're doing. So how has that been approached? Well, there are multiple ways to segue in. And one can be those direct conversations with someone where you really use the data or the research to further the discussion and show that with strategic changes that there will be growth or there will be positive outcomes that will happen if you follow certain steps. And obviously they've called you there for a reason. You want something to change, but the change will not happen unless you put in specific measures or strategies that would cause a different outcome.
Part of your job, a big part of your job right now is to go into classrooms to observe students or teachers and provide strategies and feedback. What is in that immediate bag of tricks that you kind of pull out of your pocket to bring to teachers?
So I think assistive technology is one, especially for our more traditional students who are gifted and talented with a learning disability, or GTLD students, that, okay, we need for them to be able to have access to the curriculum. They may be reading on a kindergarten level, but able to comprehend on a 7th grade level if we give them access. And so we still need to work on this piece, but speech to text, text to speech, word prediction, different highlighter tools, digital graphic organizers, it can be a game changer for students, especially our 21st century learners who know how to use technology, and it just opens up a lot of possibilities for them that things that are just printed don't.
Sure. So scaffolding in general is just providing different tiers of instruction. So for example, if lesson is based for a general class, obviously you're going to have some students who need additional support for remedial help or reteaching because they did not grasp the concept fully in order to meet the target objective. The opposite would be true for scaffolding up. So for students who the learning target is within their reach, perhaps it's the performance category or how they're demonstrating their learning that needs to be looked at more closely. So perhaps instead of writing a 5-paragraph essay, for example, which could be the outcome or the objective on a given topic, some students may need that scaffolded down where they're producing the same content, but perhaps less output. But students who maybe need it scaffolded up may create a project-based learning around what that same outcome would be to communicate the same learning objectives, but it would look different than per se a traditional 5-paragraph essay.
Everybody needs strategies related to autism, right? It just happens to hit these kids a little harder. But man, when I came out of autism and worked with more gen ed kids, I realized like, I'm making everybody cry. Like, this is terrible. And I realized because I had to be so big, and to have kids understand. But the same rule applies. Like, everybody needs. If you give those kids advance notice, like they're going to respond to it regardless, right? Everybody needs. It's the same stuff, and if you have that in your toolbox, you can do amazing things for everybody.
I also, something you kind of said earlier, it made me think about especially when we talk about that discrepancy piece. And, a lot of times when kids have that high verbal IQ, that 130, we almost liken it to like a Jeopardy situation. Like we expect that if you're smart, if you're an advanced thinker, you're also a fast thinker. And we forget sometimes that deep thought takes time. And then deep thought, when you have a processing issue, takes even more time. And so I think breaking that cycle too, or breaking that myth that speed plays a factor always on the gifted side, but also like speed can play a factor on the disability side.
And I promise you, parents are pushing that, right? We see it all the time, and we know it's one of those like silent indicators, right? We know we don't see it happening. We can see because the kids internalize it. The kids know I have to be fast at this. I have to do these facts so fast. And why can I do this? I can tell you what, 32 million divided by 12 is, but I can't add 3 plus 2 and then do it quickly. And the kids really do internalize it. So getting the kids to also understand, that's not what we're going for here.
I think we also see the other side of that are students who have the academic piece, but are struggling with the executive functioning piece. And how do we, even though they can do all of it, how do we break it down for them? How do we use checklists? How do we teach them to use timers or self-advocate for taking breaks or whatever it is that they need? And I think building in some of those different executive functioning supports is another go-to.
I feel like we get a lot of requests for supporting twice exceptional kids. And when we say, what's the issue? The answer we get is behavior. How do we address it kind of broadly?
So I think generally we start with a functional behavior assessment and really look at what is the function of this behavior? Is the student trying to avoid something? Are they trying to get something? Are they trying to access something? Or is there a sensory component to it? And once we've really identified why that student is experiencing whatever behavior or frustration it is, then looking at what teaching strategies do we need to use? Because if there's a skill deficit, we need to address that social emotional skill deficit, even if they're very gifted in other areas. And then looking at what can we do to be proactive. And I think this is so important for all of our students, but especially our twice exceptional students, that we may need to make some changes to the environment or to the workload and to how we present things to lower their anxiety. How can we meet anxiety with support instead of meeting anxiety with directives for a student? How can we front load as much as possible what is going to happen? And how do we teach them their skills and their coping strategies when they're calm? Because they need to be fluent in those strategies when they're calm, because we're not going to teach it to them in the moment. That's not ever successful.
So it really varies because this is an area where I'm continually learning in my own professional expertise. But what I have learned so far is that the way students want to express themselves will look very different. So providing alternative ways for students to demonstrate their learning is one concept I keep in my bag of tricks, so to speak, when going out to serve schools where I might see a student who has met or has shown some of the indicators through the academic file review prior to making any recommendations. I would need to know more specifically what the impact areas are and what the concerns are, as well as where the student's strengths and needs are. So for example, I've had a couple cases where students have met the 2E or twice exceptional criteria overall, but are significantly impacted in their reading, phonemics, and awareness area. So the way that they need to approach literacy and text needs to be really targeted in the approach. So perhaps students would, in that scenario, use some hurdle help or a teaching tool in addition to the remediation on those specific skill deficits. So students might need to use Google Read and Write or text to speech to help them with their reading needs where they're impacted. The same could be said for a student who's affected in the math areas, but not in literacy specifically. So it really depends on the individual learner needs, what recommendations would be made, but that would be one example.
I feel like that's a hard one for teachers to wrap their head around. Why am I taking time out of my day to teach a kid how to use a fidget or teach them how to do coloring to a release when they're not having the issue? But how do you address that?
I think we talk about, I make it personal for the staff. And when you're not in a great place and someone is telling you and trying to coach you through what to do, it doesn't work. think about how the brain works. And we have our emotional brain and we have our rational brain. Once students start to get into that mode where they're frustrated, at that point, that emotional brain starts to take over, and that student isn't thinking rationally. And so we may have very rational suggestions, but they're not in a place where they're able to hear it. And so we need to teach it to them. They need to be able to explain, how do I use my fidget? How do I use my coloring strategy, my breathing, whatever it is that's been identified for that student. And they need to know how to do it when they're calm, so that they can do it in those moments when they're experiencing heightened emotions.
So you talked about at least one or two of our kids.
Mhm.
You know, and I know I made me think of another one that we have where, like you said, he's reading on a kindergarten-ish level, but
Mhm.
we're also looking for a copy of the multivariable calculus book as an audio
Mhm.
to support that
Yeah.
reading need. Can you tell me either about like that kid that you think of when you think of twice exceptional, or a couple of the kids, and like what it is about them that made you realize that's who they were, and kind of why they needed you as a special educator?
So I think the one you brought up was, I think, your traditional twice exceptional student that most people think of. They have a learning disability and are well above grade level in one area, and I mean, really far below grade level in another area. And through different meetings for this student, originally, when he was younger, we were trying to remediate the reading with reading interventions. And then this year, the team came to a point where we determined that he's about to graduate, and reading is a functional life skill. But at the same time, he's getting ready to go off to college. We have 1 year left, and decided to shift course to how can we really focus on working with him to be an independent assistive technology user, so that he could access his college courses and access that above grade level piece instead of focusing on the reading piece. But that was a decision that was made at an IEP meeting with a lot of input from parents and school team. And we shifted our focus as he got older.
I think that's a great example. What about an example of a student who maybe we've reviewed
Mhm.
and we've decided that they didn't need the IEP, that really they're twice exceptional, but maybe they're graduated from special ed services, or we decided that the 504 is more appropriate? Do you have any cases you can think of around that, like that?
I feel like I'm not involved in as many of those, because typically once they're rising to our level, we're looking at special education, or they're going through the identification process. But so I think I can speak more to that as a teacher than an instructional specialist. But I had a little girl maybe about 8 years ago at this point, and she had ADHD. And had some needs around impulsivity. And we went through the screening process, and we did assessments, and ultimately determined that she was a good advocate for herself. She knew her strategies. She was accessing onto above grade level curriculum. And what she needed was breaks and extra time and notes and outlines. And there may have been some other things, but she didn't need that specially designed instruction piece, because she already knew how to use her tools. She just needed those tools available to her.
Excellent. So that really is what it comes down to, is what is the specially designed instruction, not do we have an intervention that matches the kid, but what is it that the kid actually needs?
Yeah, if she couldn't advocate to take her breaks and advocate for her notes and those pieces, and didn't know how to use them, then there may have been a need for specially designed instruction. But because she was independent with those pieces and was functioning onto above grade level and wasn't needing that extra support, that 504 was working for her.
Excellent.
Remember what that I in IEP is, right? And think about what that is. Think about experience, think about different perspective, think about what are some strategies you can implement to make your life easier so that you can do the amazing things that you do.
I like that. You said, what's the I in IEP? And then you said experience and perspective.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. There you go. Yeah, I'm
individual experience and perspective. I like that. That's so much more meaningful.
Okay, now I call dibs on trademark.
The genius of twice exceptional, right? Like you just, if you thought about it for a year, you wouldn't come up with it, but it just rolls off the tongue with no problem.
But it's also, I mean, I think it's important to say, like, when you asked me that question, I felt stressed, right? I genuinely was like, oh, I have to perform in this very specific way. But you gave me the room to kind of let it fly a little bit, right? And that may not work for every situation. Sometimes you just got to answer the question, right? But given the room and comfort, and I feel comfortable enough that I don't have to answer. You know, I don't have to try to like fit it in this box. You know, I threw some stuff against the wall and turned out to be kind of interesting.
So I know one of the, in some ways, the most challenging outcomes I think we have is when we find that the root cause is boredom, because we know as teachers ourselves, like sometimes students tell us they're bored because the work is too hard, but sometimes they tell us they're bored because the work is too easy. And how do you broach that conversation with a team if the evidence is showing that it's a twice exceptional child who's acting out because they're bored?
So if the data is showing and we've identified that the behaviors indicate that boredom is the cause, then we have to really hone in and talk about how to get, keep, maintain, and then grow that engagement. And since the usual and customary instruction has not been working, what needs to change? And how is that change going to happen? Who's going to provide it? How often? And how will we know the student is successful? Once we've established that and we have a clear plan, then the teachers that are implementing those changes continue to do so, and we continue to check in. And if there's growth, fantastic. We continue with that growth and set new goals. And if there's not growth, why not? And then what needs to change from there forward? And continue that investigatory process as you move forward, because the target can move over time.
I noticed you didn't have compliance in your list of expectations.
What do you mean?
So I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about behaviors, and again, especially with twice exceptional kids, we hear, you know, they don't follow directions, they don't follow the rules. And really what it comes down to is they don't comply with directives from their teacher.
What purpose do those directives serve?
So it really goes back to that questioning piece. Is it about maintaining power, or is it about actually having outcomes with the students?
Exactly. And giving the power back to the students. And it's not so much about do what I say because I'm the adult, but let's go on this journey. And this is how you can demonstrate your learning. And you have these options of how to do it. So it really comes back down to relationships. What does that relationship and the rapport look like with the staff member? If it's not there, I really work very hard to reach out to people and to connect with them on multiple levels so that we can build that relational trust and try to really work forward, because at the end of the day, we're all working for the same reason, the benefit of the student. And we really want students to be as successful as possible and give them what they need in order to make meaningful progress. And that looks different for every student.
Came in to do, which is change these kids' lives. Like it isn't that often. I mean, we're in a pretty well supported county here, so we have a lot of things. We have kids who can do a lot of things, but so it isn't every day that we have somebody we can really have a huge impact on their life. I mean, especially for students of color, especially for students who come from socioeconomic need. These are the kids really that you get so much room for impact. I mean, a lot of your kids come in, they already know how to read. They're getting outside tutoring. They're going to go to they're all going to go to Harvard or whatever. But you have these kids who come in with these rough situations, and those are the kids that we can do what we signed up to do, which is change lives.
I think it's really figuring out what an individual student needs. Twice Exceptional is such a huge umbrella, and just being willing to think creatively and try things that are a little bit outside of the box.